The films in the Indiana Jones series are notable for not being too identical to one another. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, directed by James Mangold, the first installment not directed by Spielberg, continues the series trend of not being a home run despite Spielberg and Lucas's best efforts to avoid recycling the formula of previous films. In this video, we'll take a look back at all 5 of Indiana Jones films, discussing their own strengths and weaknesses. This video is sponsored by Reeload. Let's start with the most unreasonable example. The presence of a distractingly CG created groundhog poking his head out of a mound in the opening shot of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of Crystal Skull is immediately apparent as one of the film's major flaws. A 21st century Indiana Jones film already feels fraudulent as absurd CG effects begin to seep in. Despite the fact that the series has always been about epic adventures using the best effects possible to put our hero in greatest amount of danger. In one scene, Shia LaBeouf swings with animated monkeys on a vine, and in another, a swarm of weightless CG ants carries communist troops to their death. Even if the insects in Temple of Doom were CG, the viewer could still feel their presence in connection to the performers, and this went a long way towards immersing them in Indiana Jones's exploits. While there are numerous problems with the 4th Indiana Jones movie, an overuse of CGI is one of them. The paranormally obsessed villain Irina Spalko is uninteresting even with Cate Blanchett in the lead. John Hurt is wasted as a talking map. Ray Winston's Mac is so underdeveloped that his loyalty is irrelevant. And Shia LaBeouf's performance is so over the top that it feels like he is in a completely different movie. The relationship between Indy and Marion is essentially the only interesting one in Crystal Skull. When the film's complicated plot involving saucer men from Mars starts to drag, it's a huge help that Harrison Ford and Karen Allen are able to fall right back into their old chemistry. While another religion-focused MacGuffin may have been preferable, it makes sense for Lucas and Spielberg to want to tackle this particular kind of story when moving the series into 1950s. Despite some people's objection to Indiana Jones dealing with aliens in the 4th Indy film, the issue isn't extraterrestrials per such, but rather the narrative they've chosen to tell. The quest for the Crystal Skull lacks significance, and as Indiana Jones recounts his many off-screen exploits since we last saw him, we start to wish we could see those instead. Everything about the Crystal Skull is dull, from the plot to the characters to the action sequences. The truck scene in the forest is the most interesting part of the film, but it's still difficult to care about what happens there because we don't care about the characters. It's too bad because Indiana Jones is among the most intriguing movie heroes. It took Spielberg, Lucas and Ford years to settle on a direction for the 4th Indiana Jones picture, but maybe they should have just left well enough alone if they were going to have such a hard time coming up with another great film. Almost immediately following the success of Raiders of the Lost Ark, Spielberg and Lucas began planning Temple of Doom, but they always intended for it to be darker and extremely different from the first adventure. Although Lucas's inspiration for this came from his treatment of Empire Strikes Back, the second film in the Star Wars trilogy, Temple effectively becomes a horror picture in its somewhat shockingly pitch-black third act. Spielberg opens Temple of Doom with a musical sequence reminiscent of Bugsby Berkeley, and then quickly cuts to a spectacular showdown and firefight between Indy and Lao Che. So things look good early on, but the nightclub singer Willie Scott, played by Kate Capshaw, is the first sign that things are about to become rough. Making Willie Scott the polar opposite of Marion Ravenwood meant that Indy has to share the screen with a grating, dim and infuriating self-obsessed stereotype, which was likely intentional given Spielberg and Lucas's desire to avoid repetition. Once again, Willie Scott had good intentions, but the film's focus is far too heavily on the helpless female lead, who spends the whole of the movie screaming and stomping her feet like a spoiled little girl. Unfortunately, the romantic moments she shared with Indy, which are designed to recall the style of old school screwball comedy, rarely succeed in doing so. While the hero/love interest interaction in Raiders is an example of James Bond at its best, Temple adopts some of the worst tropes from that franchise. The relationship between Ford and Ke Huy Quan culminates in the film's most successful humorous moments, which are crucial to preventing the darkness of the movie's second half from devouring the film whole. Short Round, Indy's other friend, is at least lovable enough to tolerate on screens. Some viewers were taken aback by the shocking violence at the end of the picture, which showed that Spielberg was open to the element of horror genre and B-movie cinema. While Raiders also had an extremely bloody ending, the difference comes down to pacing. Temple spreads its shock value out throughout the whole third act, whereas Raiders keeps its gore for the big payoff. The booby trap sequence leading up to the temple is one of Spielberg's best ever, and the final minecar pursuit is exciting. So Temple of Doom isn't a complete failure. However, it is not as satisfying as previous installments in the series due to a lack of a compelling sidekick, an over-reliance on the wrong kind of gloomy tone, and a diminished emphasis on Indiana Jones as an intellectual. Dial of Destiny's satisfactory finish to Indy's journey, despite the film's overall blandness, makes up for Temple of Doom's strident, unpleasant, and exceedingly problematic portions. This may seem like blasphemy, but it's true. There are some enjoyable set pieces in Dial of Destiny, such as the opening flashback to a younger Ford and a chase through Tangier with Indy's goddaughter Helena and her sidekick Teddy. But this may be the first Indy film in which the smaller moments are more enjoyable than the action sequences. Dial of Destiny makes Indy feel like a genuine person, rather than a blank slate for whatever action scenario happens to be on tap. He's a guy who is thinking back on his past exploits and having to face the consequences of his decisions. Ford is doing an excellent job as he bids farewell to this legendary character, and it is refreshing to finally see Jones portrayed as a three-dimensional person and not just as another serial star. It's hard to believe, but Dial of Destiny actually turns some of the film's weaknesses into strengths, such as when Ford gives a touching explanation for why Mutt isn't in this film, and when Indy and Marion's final moment together are extremely lovely and surprisingly moving in a way this series rarely achieves. Truth be told, we probably didn't need any more Indiana Jones film after The Last Crusade, but Dial of Destiny does a better job of wrapping up the series than Crystal Skull did, which is apparently the main reason why this picture was even made. Even though we have seen characters like this previously in the universe, this does feel more necessary than it probably is, because to the efforts of Mads Mikkelsen and the amusing addition of Phoebe Waller-Bridge to the franchise. Dial of Destiny does a serviceable job of saying farewell to one of Ford's most recognizable creation and bringing the curtains down on the series with a touch of nostalgia and enduring charm. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is brilliant because it functions almost as a covert Genesis story. You may believe you're seeing the next Indiana Jones adventure, but the whole movie is actually a backstory of the character's personality and upbringing. While immersed in an elaborate and tremendously enjoyable chase action, the film opens with young Indy as Spielberg leverages his love of westerns to lay the groundwork of some of Indy's defining characteristics. Casting River Phoenix as a young Indy was a stroke of genius, and composer John Williams turned up some of his best work with the film's climatic scenes, which saw Indy's father introduced before a brilliant transition to the adult Indy chasing the same MacGuffin decades later. The Last Crusade is the series' grand finale as Steven Spielberg and George Lucas send their hero on a global quest to retrieve yet another priceless sacred relic. However, the adventure is only a pretense. In another example of perfect casting, James Bond actor Sean Connery plays Indy's father, and the reconciliation is important to the plot. Ford and Connery's chemistry is brilliantly realized. There's tension, but it's never malicious, and despite their distance, they play the dominant and submissive roles in a way that are both subtle and effective, often conjuring their entire relationship with a single glance. As a retort to Temple of Doom, the film is also Spielberg and Lucas's response. It enjoys the witty cerebral exchange of raiders but avoids the temple's gorier elements in the favor of witty banter. Some of the dramatic tension is lost as a result of this shift in tone, but the film ultimately strikes a great balance and builds to the most emotionally charged climax of the series. While The Last Crusade certainly makes a good case for the best of Indiana Jones' crew, I have to give the nod to Raiders of the Lost Ark due to its consistently high level of crispness and filmmaking. Spielberg's upbeat, risk-taking thrill adventure is flawless in every way. Marion Ravenwood, portrayed by Karen Allen, is just as engaging as Indiana Jones, but she isn't a clone. The film is propelled by the dynamic between the two leads, and Ford's performance of Indiana Jones is a triumph of moxie, intelligence, and luck. Jones is unlike any other action hero because he is perpetually over his head. He doesn't have everything planned out 30 moves in advance, and that improvisatory spirit only adds to the thrill of the ride. Since the audience never knows what they'll face next, believe me, he does. But it's a hair's breadth every time. In addition to being a smart visual device, the recurring scene of Indy frantically grasping off his hat at the last second has come to symbolize the character of Indiana Jones. Sometimes he escapes harm, but only by the hair of his nose. Spielberg does an excellent job of establishing the universe and the hero in the film's prologue, which mimics Bond by opening with a set piece unrelated to the rest of the story. This first scene tells us nearly all we need to know about Indy, while the second scene reveals that a dashing hero is actually a highly intellectual professor at Marshall College, providing us with much more insight into his character, in contrast to the secret identity dynamic typically depicted in superhero novels. Jones enjoys both his day job and his escapades equally. He has no need to conceal either of his personalities. Now that we have some distance from the picture, we can appreciate how language and character development drove the blockbuster, that is Raiders of the Lost Ark. While there are some action sequences and exciting set pieces, the bulk of the movie consists of relationships between the characters, because the spectator isn't being flooded with adrenaline shot after shot. The set pieces that Spielberg does deliver are more effective. They are perfectly timed, expertly written, and based entirely on the personality of people involved. That equilibrium, along with some of the most interesting characters ever seen on the film, plus a healthy helping of Harrison Ford's charisma and vulnerability, makes for a masterpiece that will stand the test of time. Looking for a discovery app that has everything you need for your TV shows, movies, and streaming needs? Look no further than Reeload. Reeload is your ultimate guide to discovering new content and staying up to date on the latest releases. For personalized movie recommendations and to keep up with what your friends are watching, download Reeload. However, it's important to keep in mind that rankings are subjective and that every film has its own dedicated audience. Everyone can agree that Indiana Jones has provided us incredible experiences and hours of entertainment, regardless whether you agree with our list or not. We appreciate your company on this cinematic adventure. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and enable push notifications so you don't miss any of the future action. Keep on adventuring, discovering new things till we meet again, and may good fortune and glory follow you wherever you go.